The title of this plenary and Fred Busch's paper is Our Vital Profession. I'm Harriet Wolf. I'm a psychiatrist from San Francisco, where I'm a training and supervising analyst at the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis. I'm also president-elect of the American Psychoanalytic Association. I want to thank Harriet Basajas and the program committee for inviting me to chair this important plenary. I'm deeply honored to be here with all of you and with the illustrious colleagues to my right. They will share their thoughts about our vital profession and stimulate our own thinking about the nature of who we are and how we function as contemporary psychoanalysts. Yesterday afternoon, Stefano Bolognini spoke to us of the future of psychoanalysis. He spoke of skeptics who say psychoanalysis is no longer what it used to be, who claim it as a thing of the past. Stefano challenged us to ask ourselves, what kind of analyst would we choose if we needed to refer a loved one? An analyst trained in the golden era of psychoanalysis, or one situated clinically and intellectually in current time? Fred Busch, in his fascinating paper, Our Vital Profession, details for us in a most compelling way why we would turn to a psychoanalyst who has a modern psychoanalytic mind, and exactly why our profession is in fact vital. He helps us see what a modern psychoanalytic mind is and how it comes to be both for us and for our analysans. It's my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Fred Busch, our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Harriet. So I'll start with a quote. It's told that the scientist Isaac Asimov once said, "The most exciting phrase in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not Eureka, I found it, but that's funny." Now, it's not, that phrase means not funny, ha-ha funny, but like, oh, that's interesting. So that's Asimov's point, that it's not Eureka, it's, interesting. What Asimov captures is that new discoveries are based more on curiosity than knowledge alone. As you'll see in my talk, I will show how this curiosity emerges in our patient's mind while demonstrating the significant changes in psychoanalytic technique over the last 40 years that reflect Asimov's idea. These changes revolve around the role of the analyst moving from primarily providing the patient with knowledge to his awakening in the patient, the capacity to be curious, about what is unknown and unthinkable. I see this as one of the major factors in keeping psychoanalysis vital. There are many elements that contributed to this shift, which I will outline today, but have been described in depth in my book, Creating a Psychoanalytic Mind. In considering the trajectory of our field, regardless of which Freud we follow, the important differences we have in our models of the mind, and some of the specific variances we have in analytic technique, there have been some paradigm shifts in some of the most basic ways we approach our patients that serves as a new common ground among seemingly disparate points of view. These changes are based upon insights from colleagues from different perspectives. Yet, the profundities of these breakthroughs seem hardly to have been noticed. I think this is because these changes have been the result of an evolutionary process that led to the gradual incorporation into clinical practice, rather than the revolutionary methods some newer theories proclaim. What we see are changes based upon clinical practice within a broadly defined Freudian-based model, while incorporating other views of psychoanalytic technique. Let me start with this story, The Girl on the Beach. Sitting on a beach, I notice a young girl looking for seashells about 15 feet from the water, a place where there were very few shells. After a while, her mother, who is there quietly helping her, says, "Would you like to go closer to the water, where there might be some more shells?" The little girl says yes, but for some time continues looking in the same place. Later, she moves closer to the water, where she begins to pick up numerous shells. I would suggest this observation might serve as a model for a current view of psychoanalytic technique. First, let us deconstruct the event. The young girl is searching in a place where it is difficult to find what she seeks. She's like our patients who, caught up in unconscious conflict, keep looking for something to solve their problems, but end up searching in the same place, finding no solutions. The mother doesn't tell her daughter to stop what she's doing, but wonders with the girl if it might be helpful to search for what she seeks somewhere else. In the mother's wondering, I would like to highlight the following. The little girl is not told what to do. She isn't forced to search elsewhere. She isn't told where she's looking is wrong, but rather she's given a choice to explore somewhere else, someplace she may have not thought of yet, or might never have thought of on her own. The potential of a new place emerges, a place to be curious about. In this way, she is given agency to make her own decision. The little girl first doesn't respond, but keeps searching in this same area, even though it has not led to promising results. There is some resistance to moving away from her spot. The mother doesn't make any further suggestions or give any other ideas. But after a while, the little girl decides on her own to move towards more fertile ground and ends up with her desires fulfilled. Paradigm changes. Two of the most significant paradigm shifts in clinical psychoanalysis came about with a change in focus from working directly with the unconscious and searching for what has been repressed to the general recognition across theoretical perspectives that it is important to work more closely with what is preconscious, and the emphasis on building representations of what was previously unthought or underrepresented, as well as what was repressed. These views are dependent upon the realization, and this is very important because I think we haven't, I think it's an important observation that I think is worth thinking about, which is we think of the unconscious as like a place. It's just like one place. And that's how we talk about it, the unconscious. But if you remember Freud's drawings, the unconscious wasn't a place, it was a place with depth. And it went from some endless place right up to the edge of the preconscious. And then the preconscious went from the edge of the unconscious up to the consciousness. So we're dealing with different layers of depth. So when we talk about something being unconscious, we don't make distinctions as to, well, where in the unconscious is it? Is it close to the preconscious, so that's why we can talk directly to it, so that it's just over the border? Or is it something much deeper than that? I think these kinds of distinctions are very important in terms of our understanding why or how we are interpreting when we talk about interpreting the unconscious. For too long, we've labored under the belief that we needed to interpret in a way that the patient directly experienced his or her unconscious, as Strachey suggested, without taking into account all that needed to occur before unconscious ideations or feelings could be meaningfully taken into awareness. Further, as noted by LaCours and many others, building representations is the key to structure building, which enhances the ability to contain psychic energies. This leads to what Green called binding the inchoate and containing it, thus giving a container to the patient's content and content to his container. The representations we build can be as delineated as a word, as complex as a metaphor, or as fleeting as an Ogden waking dream. Whether it becomes something that is representable for the analysand depends on many, many factors, including how close it comes to what is tolerable at that exact clinical moment. That is, the patient's capacity to transform the elements of his familiar thinking into a potentially new gestalt. After each intervention, we see what the patient can make of it at that particular moment. We can call it the work of the alpha function or his ego function. Decisive is whether the patient can allow our interventions to work on his or her mind. A third paradigm change that alters the way we work, and in this I'm not giving all the references when I talk about paradigm changes. There are many people who talk about this, and but in order to make this more streamlined, I'm just talking about what they're talking about and what I'm talking about rather than giving all the references. A third paradigm change that alters the way we work is the development of what I call process knowledge. This is different than what I call state knowledge, which is the one we are most familiar with. In this latter kind of knowledge, state knowledge, we are in a state of knowing. That is, something that was unknown is now known. For example, what was previously unconscious is now conscious. The other type of knowing that has been less familiar to us is what I call process knowledge. It centers on how one thinks rather than what one thinks. Most patients' thinking in the beginning of an analysis is concrete. The patient thinks, but she cannot think about her thinking. In the midst of conflict, patients often think of their thoughts primarily as realities. At the heart of process knowledge is the capacity to think of one's thoughts as mental events. Others have captured the idea of process knowledge in a variety of ways. We see it in Green's statement, quote, "The aim of an interpretation is not to produce insight directly, but to facilitate the psychic functioning that is likely to help insight develop." Clinical implications. So now I'm going to be talking about certain changes in how I think a number of different analysts think about the clinical situation, and then I'll be giving a clinical example that will demonstrate some of it. I was just wondering what they're talking about up there. There are certain changes in our methods of working that flow directly from the paradigm shifts I've noted above. Increasingly, we've paid attention to how and why we bring our observations and interpretations to the patient's awareness, and the profound effect this has on the patient's ability to use what we have to say. It is another way of looking at the two-person nature of psychoanalysis, while holding on to our understanding that it is the inner life of the patient we can help change by building structure. In what I'll describe, you will find the innovative ideas of psychoanalysts from different perspectives that have contributed to the vitality of contemporary psychoanalysis. Interpreting in the neighborhood. In Freud's 1910 paper on wild analysis, he makes this well-known statement: if knowledge about the unconscious were as important for the patient as people inexperienced in psychoanalysis suggest or imagine, Listening to lectures or reading books would be enough to cure him. Such measures, however, have as much influence on the symptoms of nervous illness as a distribution of menu cards in a time of famine has upon hunger. That's a beautiful phrase. Since, however, psychoanalysis cannot dispense with giving this information, it lays down that this shall not be done before the patient must, through preparation himself, have reached the neighborhood of what he has repressed. Yet listening to discussions of the clinical process, one is impressed with how many interpretations seem based less on what the patient is capable of hearing and more on what the analyst is capable of understanding. Maybe it's only that the presenter didn't bring the audience into the neighborhood of what he did. But maybe we too often confuse our ability to read the unconscious with the patient's ability to understand it. We are frequently not clear enough in distinguishing between an unconscious communication and our ability to communicate with the patient's unconscious. What the patient can hear, understand, and effectively utilize, let alone the benefits of considering such an approach, has only gradually been entering the foreground of our clinical discussions. Language action. First identified by Freud, this concept catches a patient's way of talking that is unconsciously meant to do something. At these times, words become attempts to bore, seduce, anger, or excite the analyst. While it seems like the patient is describing a dream, an upsetting event, or complaining about a spouse, the analyst feels mocked for his interest in dreams, blamed for the patient's bad luck, or faced with a demand for unconditional love. While we've been aware of the consequences of language action for some time, as it most often leads to the analyst's countertransference reaction, it is only recently that we've understood the importance of clarifying with the patient how language action is expressed before identifying its effects or its unconscious meaning. We can hear this approach in Feldman's description of Betty Joseph's work when he says, her assumption is that real psychic change is more likely to be promoted by the detailed description of how the patient is using the analyst, using interpretations, or using her mind in a given session, and then to move on to the way the patient's history and unconscious fantasies express themselves in the immediacy of the process and interactions in the sessions. End of quote. That is, we first try to clarify the how of what the patient is doing with us in their words, tone, and phrasing of sentences. Gabriel Pisochin, my colleague here who will be one of the discussions, described this as listening to the enacted. This then needs to be clarified for the patient, which often takes considerable time in order to catch the many nuances language action takes. In this way, we begin to represent what is going on in the action of words. It is only then that we can tell if the patient can tolerate the work of representation or needs to reject it. There is no point in interpreting until the patient can understand what's happening and can accept and think about what's happening in their use of language action. It's important to remember that the entire range of psychic states can be expressed in language action. My sense is in that our countertransference reaction to language action, we've overemphasized what the patient is doing to the analyst rather than what he might also be doing to himself. For example, repairing a fragile self-state. Countertransference. The discovery of the importance of countertransference thoughts and feelings as a crucial source of information in the psychoanalytic situation has been one of our most significant advances. Beginning with the pioneering work of the Kleinians on projective identification and followed by so many others, We've come to realize its significance in understanding every patient at some time in their analysis, and its importance in understanding other patients from the moment they walk into our consulting group. However, we also need to heed Hannah Siegel's warning that countertransference is our best servant and worst master. As essential as it is a tool in our analytic work, it also provides data that is difficult to sort out and translate. A particular problem analysts face is when we experience a countertransference feeling, we often feel forced by the patient into what seems like an alien position. This can drive us to push back and force the patient to accept his or her unconscious. At these times, the countertransference interpretation seems to be the result from an urge to expel what is transferred back onto the patient. You feel this way, not me, we seem to be saying, while meaning to be exploratory or interpretive. It is the way of the analyst getting rid of something uncomfortable stirred in his or her own unconscious. Another problem we can run into is the temptation to read our countertransference reactions as an unerring guide to the patient's behavior, what I call the Descartesian somersault. I think, therefore you are. Interpsychic communication. Bolognini introduced the term interpsychic to capture the conscious and unconscious dialogue of two interacting people, patient and analyst. A territory for which we have only barely been able to find words, despite all the words that are in use for it. A quote from Schmidt-Hellerup. Michael Diamond shows the contributions and acceptance of this term, interpsychic, from a wide variety of psychoanalytic cultures, although not labeled as such. In short, this term interpsychic broadens the field for the analyst to include a number of states of mind, often thought of as separate, thus giving a frame for tackling greater complexity in the patient-analyst dialogue. Analyst-centered interpretations. Steiner introduced an important clinical term, analyst-centered interpretations, for working with more disturbed patients where, quote from Steiner, the priority for the patient is to get rid of unwanted mental contents which he projects into the analyst. In these states, he is able to take very little back into his mind. I would add that analyst-centered interpretations are useful in the full spectrum of pathologies, especially early in the treatment and throughout the treatment when new regression takes place. This is because all of our patients are dealing with unconscious thoughts and feelings that are terrifying to know about, as they are associated in the patient's unconscious mind with the most frightening terrors known to man. Working in the here and now. In 1914, Freud observed, we must treat the patient's illness, not as an event of the past, but as a present-day force. How often this insight was employed and the manner in which it was used has varied over time. However, many analysts now view the psychoanalytic session as primarily a series of psychic events happening before the patient and us, and therefore as the ideal time to intervene. As the patient is most often thinking in a concrete, before the eye reality, it is essential for him to potentially observe himself in the immediacy of what is happening in the session, in accordance with the level of his ego functioning. Much of what we work with, associations, language action, affect shifts, etc., is most accessible to the patient as it is occurring in the session. As the patient is able to contain more and becomes a better observer of himself, the analyst is freer to move more comfortably between present and past sessions, while interpretations become more metaphorical or enigmatic. I want to make clear, I am not suggesting we restrict psychoanalysis to work. We restrict psychoanalytic work to the dynamics of what is present in the analytic situation. Understanding the past and the present is crucial to enliven our patient's sense of who they were and who they are, while building more complex representations. Here's what I consider an everyday clinical moment of working what I call within the transference. Excuse me. I don't think it's been emphasized enough that from the very beginning, Freud had two views of transference. The first is the one most commonly used, where Freud referred to the effect of past object relations on the patient's view of the analysis. However, at the same time, Freud suggests a broader definition of transference, where the transference can be a reflection of the patient's state of mind in the analysis, not only a representation of past object relations. Kohut's description of a self-object transference to project a tragic narcissistic state is an example of this type of transference. The second definition also includes seeing the analytic relationship as representing the stage on which the patient reenacts his symptoms, memories, dreams, and current experiences, which are driven by multiple factors, past object relations being one amongst many. So, for example, so often we hear the patient was saying something to the patient, was saying something to the analyst, and the analyst started feeling angry. And the question is, what is that? That is it something that the patient is doing for himself, that is maybe taking a stance to protect a state of well-being, or is he doing something to the analyst? I think we have to make, because we feel something doesn't necessarily mean that the patient is doing something to us. They may be doing something to themselves to repair some kind of psychic state that they are in at that particular moment. And I think we've sort of lost that idea in some ways. That'll be a controversial point, I'm sure, somewhere along the way. Any interpretation of a transference begins with an unsaturated clarification. That is, in the midst, I'm borrowing Nino Ferro's term from an unsaturated interpretation to an unsaturated clarification. That is, in the midst of an intense transference reaction, the patient's thinking is generally pre-symbolic. While the analyst is alerted to the transference in multiple ways, these feelings or reveries need to be translated into something pre-consciously available for the patient, usually in the form of something the patient is doing with language or affect states, for example, leaving off the end of sentences. The patient needs to have some experience and pre-conscious awareness of what we're interpreting before we interpret it. Anna. It's a Monday appointment with Anna, and she flies into her analytic session. Before she even lies down on the couch, Anna states, "I couldn't wait to tell you about this weekend." In a rush, she begins to tell me at great length of the various ways her husband mistreated her. It was not told in any great distress, but more in the form of a conspiratorial togetherness. It was a story I heard many times from Anna, so her feeling that she couldn't wait to tell me struck me as an important indicator of some way she was viewing the analyst and/or our relationship. When Anna paused for a breath, I empathized with how distressing this seemed to be, and also wondered about this couldn't wait to tell me feeling. But she cut me off saying, yes, but let me tell you about this other incident that happened. Anna then proceeded to tell me a lengthy story where she visited her parents, and her mother spent a long time on the phone with her sister, and she had to wait a long time to speak to her mother. There were many other slights as well. I was again impressed with how propelled she was to tell me this story, again familiar, of mistreatment. My previous remarks seemed to have hardly registered. I felt pushed out of her narrative. Another story of a similar nature quickly followed, presented in the same breathless manner. Listening to these stories, I sensed an excited quality in her breathlessness. After a brief pause, I said to Anna that again she seemed in a rush to tell me what happened, so much that it seemed difficult to register what I said. After a brief pause, Anna said, "I hate your voice." Puzzled and intrigued, I waited. She then said, "I had a sexual dream about you last night. It wasn't you in the dream, but it was a tall guy with a beard. We made love in the most tender and exciting way. When we finished, I cried. Obviously, I didn't want to tell you. It makes me so sad when I think of being loved instead of being fucked. Better to go on feeling angry about being fucked than this overwhelming sadness. It's really scary, but maybe the dream indicates it's not as scary as it was." This vignette is prototypical of how I work within the transference. That is, in words and action, and language action, the patient tells me simultaneously that as she's excited to see me, she can't wait, and is afraid of her wish to be loved. It's more comfortable to feel fucked, as she did in all of her associations. Rather than analyzing this from outside the immediacy of what is being expressed, for example, addressing the enactment as a past relationship or something the patient is doing to or with the analyst, or a reflection of some feelings about the analyst specifically not being there, the expression of how the transference is expressed in the session, how the transference is expressed in the first session, first needs to be empathically captured and clarified by the analyst. With Anna, it's only when this rush to tell me stories to keep me out is clarified that the anger and sadness over the exciting and scary things she wants from me can be revealed in her dream and begin to be mourned as a step towards finding what she desires. Anna is defending and enacting with this rush to tell me. Again, what I'm highlighting is, in this example is that before any interpretation of the transference content, it's important to clarify the specifics of dynamic within the patient's way of relating. It's a way of concretizing the manner in which the transference fantasy or the defense against it is being expressed in the analytic session, and seeing what part, if any, the patient can elaborate. Final thoughts. The approach I've outlined below is the basis for what I've called creating a psychoanalytic mind, where there is a shift in the patient's relationship with his own mind. This shift, hopefully, is designed to allow the patient to become a thinker capable of once again thinking, thus changing the inevitability of action to the possibility of reflection. It is only with this capacity to reflect about their own thinking that our patients can discover the enormous potential of their minds, be it as a source of or contributing to their misery and suffering, be it as a trove of pleasure and creativity to be used in order to achieve their life's goals. Finally, in 2010, Bolognini noted we have to come out of our own shadow zone, where we hold on to excessive simplification of the theoretical field. The symptom of the shadow zone is precisely the incapacity for an interchange with the non-self, which is unconsciously feared as dangerous and too disturbing. It's my impression that IPA programs, like the introduction of the CAPSA program, pioneered by Claudio Isaac and reinstated by Stefano Bolognini, have done much to change the atmosphere so that we no longer, for the most part, treat other people's theories like toothbrushes. No self-respecting person wants to use another's. While hard-nosed critical thinking can be an important tool, it may also be a defense against the risky insight that absorption in another's views can offer. In looking at my thinking over the last 15 years, I started out as what I would call an ego psychologist, but now I wouldn't even call myself that. Even though this will always be the basis of my clinical thinking. Change is never easy. We tend to cling to what's familiar to us, what we know about ourselves and our world. However, if we remain open to learn and revise our ideas, as our founding father, Sigmund Freud, wasn't afraid to demonstrate, then psychoanalysis will continue to grow and develop through the 21st century. It helps to have a set of open, knowledgeable, reflective colleagues or colleague, as I did in my journey in the form of my wife, Dr. Cordelia Schmidt-Hellerow. So here we are again, as psychoanalysts from around the world, trying to learn from each other while trying to learn how to talk and listen with each other. But why do we continue, I wonder, when it seems so difficult for us? I think because what binds us together is our passion for psychoanalysis. We've seen what it can do for us, our patients, its vital nature. And in spite of the antagonism we faced from other perspectives and from each other, we deeply care about this legacy from Freud and our sometimes perilous journey as we look into the future at this Congress. Thank you for your attention.